All right, what's up, everyone? This is Eric. I'm Chris. I'm with Eric, and we also have Edwin, special guest on the Commish Fantasy Football Podcast. Edwin, how's it going, bud?
And it's going right. Insert Corona joke virus here about how bored you are. I'm basically going from here to the clinic, to the grocery store, and then back. And sometimes I'll get to the grocery store and I'll peek around the parking lot and go, I can wait. I guess I'll come back later. And then I go another 2 or 3 days without following up. What about you guys?
Yeah, same here. I mean, I think we're doing the best we can. We realized that Walmart has no more paper products, so that's awesome.
I went to Market Basket yesterday, and it was like a war zone.
Yeah,
It really is.
I kind of felt bad though, because there was so many elderly people there, and you kind of just wish that someone would go for them. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
like I went for our grandmother, and I just felt bad for everyone that I saw. But
yeah,
absolute chaos out there right now.
Are you guys related?
We are. Yeah, we're cousins.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, cool. That's badass. Family business, huh?
It is actually. It's nice.
That's cool.
It's convenient in terms of location. I'll say that.
Right.
Yeah. Cool, bro. Well, listen, again, thank you so much for coming on. We were chatting a bit behind the scenes before we actually got onto this episode. And I think the thing that we wanted to sort of do, again, sort of two perspectives here. You're coming on as sort of a medical expert. We'll go into your background before we dive into the players in the NFL that we sort of wanted to touch on. But we want to sort of come at it from a perspective of, we're sort of the common man watching the games every single day, and you're coming at it from a medical lens. And I'm sure it's hard for you to take that hat off when you're watching these types of games and you see injuries and it's like, I kind of know what's going on here. Whereas like, a fan like me, I'm just mad because my guy got hurt in the first quarter, right? And I have no idea what's really going on. So I think that's sort of the breakdown. But, with that said, maybe give us our listeners sort of a breakdown of exactly, who you are, what you're doing, and why we brought you on. We lost you. On the.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
No, all good.
I just unmuted myself. So I said I was born in the log cabin in 18. I'm just kidding. No. So I am from Southwest Kansas, middle of nowhere, and I went to school at K-State. Go Cats! And then now I'm in physical therapy school in my last year. In my last 6 weeks, through Kansas, like a school in Kansas City. But right now I'm in California. I know it's getting confusing. So my school's in Kansas City. I finished up all my book work. And then the last 8 weeks, I'm on my last clinical rotation here in California. So essentially I'm supposed to graduate, be a doctor of physical therapy, except they canceled my ceremony at this point. So I'm supposed to graduate in May, and then go on, and I'm going to do an orthopedic residency. So it's sort of like an extra year of specialized training to be considered like a true specialist and sit for the exam and the whole deal. Sure. So this time next year, that's the plan. The timeline has obviously probably been thrown off to some extent now. Yeah. Who knows when they'll start testing. My boards for my clinical exam is supposed to be April 28th, but at this point it's like, who knows if we'll have that. So, but that's essentially where I'm at right now. Is I'm 6 weeks from graduation. I've done a giant chunk, like 98% of my schoolwork, and I'll be ready to go, theoretically speaking, by the end of this 6 weeks, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah. So what are your sort of clinical boards? What's sort of that next step for you? And then I guess on top of that, just an add-on question is, when you're done with your clinical boards, what exactly do you want to get yourself into?
So when I graduate, I've got set up a sort of verbal agreement to work in this outpatient clinic with the people I'm staying with, actually. So they'll train me because he's a part of the program that I applied to sort of do that sort of mentorship. So every week you'll sit down, or you do like a morning or an afternoon of mentorship, and they basically just grill you, boom, boom, boom. Why did you go this direction with this decision when you were examining that patient? And here's what the evidence says about this. And they just basically, they beat you down to a pulp until you are doing things as closely to perfect as you possibly can. Cool. So that's what I'm hoping to do. I'm hoping to treat sort of, not necessarily athletes, but I appreciate treating patients who are coming in who are just like super strong on their own, and they're like cyclists or they're CrossFitters or whatever, but they just have like something, oh, my shoulder just, it really hurts. So that's when a coach's eye is really, really, really helpful and really beneficial. So those are the types of people I'd like to treat. So Great. Sort of rolls into this sports medicine side of fantasy that I really enjoy and appreciate.
Yeah, well, that's a good segue. So I guess sort of the next topic would be, what is sort of your background with sports, fantasy, football, all that stuff.
So that's the thing about the Twitter, right? The Twitter account that I sort of seemed to catch a little bit of fire recently. Started in August, and really it just came down because I've always played fantasy football for like the last 3 or 4 years, right? And so every time that there was some sort of injury, I would just Google like, XYZ injury. Never found anything, and eventually I got to the point where I was like, I'm just gonna like figure this out on my own and do it. It started really last year when I really started gain traction in terms of like actually having an idea of clinical knowledge and how that applies to like sports injuries and stuff. And I started applying it. And I remember we were driving back from my hometown, and my wife was with me, and I was like, I think I'm just going to like do this. I think I'm just going to start this Twitter account and help because I was like, I'm not going to get into like the numbers, the analytics, the rankings and stuff. Like, I'm just going to talk about injuries because that's my wheelhouse. Yeah. And she was like, okay, whatever. And then eventually I remember we I first started, it obviously wasn't that long ago, but in like September I was like, babe, I got 50 followers. And she was like, awesome, good for you. She just sort of let me do my thing. She's like, whatever, I feel like I'm just kid in a candy store. So but anyway, that's really what I started. I love sports injuries, I love sports medicine, I love everything revolving around the rehab and recovery, obviously, because it's my as a physical therapist, it's going to be my jam. Yeah. But the fantasy side of it was really where that connection point was to like, it was just different enough to what I was doing every day to where it was like almost like an escape sort of. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, so I know that, you and Eric obviously is really, he basically runs our little Twitter page. Yeah, that's how this account. Yeah, so anybody that connects with the Commish, you're really connected with Eric on Twitter. Me on Instagram.
So, fun fact, Edwin and I actually go back pretty much at the beginning. Like when we first got our Twitter page, Edwin was probably one of the first people that we ended up following. We were just little guys in the community. Yeah. We were a small account, help me and help you. And it's crazy to see Edwin's account take off. He's up at like 1,700 followers.
That's
already.
Awesome.
But you guys aren't a small deal either at this point, though.
We're getting there.
Year 2. So I mean, we've learned a lot, which is awesome. But so one of the people that I really follow, I talked about this on a collab episode with Sky Guasco from TCK podcast. We both like Gary Vaynerchuk, and Gary. Anybody listens to Gary, he obviously has a lot of principles that he follows. But when it comes to building sort of a brand or reputation, for anybody out there that's into building something small, and Edwin, you probably agreed to this, collabs are the way to go. Just get people on here who know more than you. And let them fucking just spit their stuff and learn. Just listen and learn and ask questions. So Eric was already doing it before he even knew who Gary Vaynerchuk was, which is good. It's good for me to hear because I kind of knew it, and I have a guy who doesn't even know Gary Vee who's doing it.
Right.
So, it's like we're all on the same page without really having a central point, which is awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it's actually been it's been pretty wild to see how fast he's grown, and you're obviously very well respected in the community. I see everybody hits up Edwin.
Awesome.
So honestly, it's an honor to have you on here. We're actually glad that you took some time out of your day to come on. So we appreciate it.
Definitely.
Yeah, I appreciate you guys having me on, man. Don't talk me up too much, because then I'm just gonna poop all over, and people are gonna be like, "What is this guy talking about? He's the worst." Like, he's just really talking me up here.
All right. This is a great segue. Let's dive right into it. I got a bone to pick with you right now. I need to understand this. So before we even get into players, we're going to talk about AJ Green, Dalvin Cook, Evan Engram, and Cam Newton on this episode. Okay, I want to get your opinions on this. But before we even get into that, I need to understand. Again, I'm coming from someone who just casually watches football, grew up with it my entire life. Apparently, you have somewhere on your Twitter account that players are not injury prone.
Yeah. Okay.
Tell me what this means to me, because in my eyes, I can name like 5 who are. So.
All right.
Explain to me from like a medical standpoint how that's not okay.
Before you even get into it, Chris might be the biggest advocate for injury prone in the world. He might be.
It's my only excuse when I draft the #1 guy and he dies. So.
Right. Okay.
Keenan Allen, David Johnson, just to name a few guys. So
that's fair.
2 years in a row, I lost my number one pick. So yeah. So I need something to hang my hat on, but I would prefer truth over my own opinion. So
wait, who was your pick this year? Your first pick?
Saquon Barkley. So.
Ooh, yeah, that's a tough one.
Now that that's like a high ankle sprain. I get through it. I wouldn't necessarily call that like an injury prone. I mean, you see this guy; he's made out of freaking iron and steel. So I wouldn't necessarily like he's injury prone, but and we'll get into it like AJ Green, Cam Newton, but just the overall principle of players not being injury prone. Explain your thought behind it.
Yeah. Okay. So zooming out, like big picture. Right. You guys look like you're pretty fit. You guys do what kind of like you guys lift weights? Do you run? What do you do? What do you guys do?
Yeah, we go to the gym pretty much. I do mostly weight training.
Okay.
Some cardio. Listen, if I'm feeling up.
Yeah.
Ahead of ourselves.
So I've actually done less weight training, although I still do. I've been trying to incorporate more cardio. But I've been doing a lot more yoga. So I actually had
cool. Yeah.
I actually had a lower back ice hockey injury, which is actually pretty common. And for me, it was sort of it was a combination of like a hamstring, sort of plantar fasciitis, at least that I thought it was. A combination of those things. And that just kind of led to my lower back. And I just kind of pulled my lower back in kind of an L5 lumbar spine problem.
Okay.
And so now I've been really focusing on yoga. So that's been
okay.
Yeah.
So if I asked you to step from ice hockey to water polo, and what do you think would happen if you were forced to do a 3-hour practice of water polo?
I would make it 10 minutes.
So the point I'm trying to make is when we look at these NFL, like truly like jokes aside, elite level athletes, right? We're watching them from our couch with, our Bud Light seltzer or whatever, our White Claw, and we're pointing and yelling, "You should have caught the ball." Yeah, right, exactly. So we need to understand, and I'm not saying this is you guys necessarily, but I feel like the bigger issue when people use the term injury prone is that they're just saying like, "Oh, but that dude's injury prone." It's like, do you know how much work, how much luck, honestly, and how much genetic gift just like was bestowed upon this person for you to even be watching them on the TV screen.
Right.
So when you say injury prone or anybody's injury prone, it's got to be relative to everything around them and everybody around them. Like I wouldn't call an offensive lineman who has like high ankle sprains and like broken fingers and dislocated fingers. I mean, we've all seen the Booger McFarland thing, right? Like that's a real thing for NFL. I can't even do it. That's a real thing for NFL linemen. Like their fingers probably dislocate every other play. They just pop them back in. So those people aren't necessarily injury prone compared to the regular population. Like throw me out on the field, man. I'll get a concussion. I'll break my leg and tear my ACL on the same play. So like it's all relative. The second thing is that it is fair. It's not that I don't think that the term injury prone is not usable, because it is. So I would not be too offended if you said relative to his contemporaries, Will Fuller is injury prone.
Thank you. That's
probably at this.
I was literally thinking about Will Fuller the entire time.
That's a fair assessment, and it's understandable because but a few things apply. Like A, it's the same type of injury every single time.
Right.
B, he's consistently shown it's the same type of injury. It's hardly ever any different. And 3, we've yet to see like a healthy Will Fuller since college. We haven't seen. So like it's sort of like that null hypothesis. Like the null hypothesis, Will Fuller can't stay healthy. At this point, I'm not willing to reject that, because if we just say like, or I'm sorry, accept that, because if we just say, oh yeah, like it's going to happen, let's accept the null hypothesis, like that's not good science, because he hasn't even shown us he can do that yet.
Exactly.
The flip side is somebody like Keenan Allen, who early on, I remember being a little bit younger, but when Keenan Allen came in the league in like 14 or 15 or whatever it was, he like tore his ACL, and then he had a fractured clavicle, and then he like had a ruptured spleen or a kidney or something. Just like
weird shit,
and none of that adds up. Like none of that adds up. And so those are the players that I'm not so much saying don't use the term injury prone. I would just say take a pause, think about it, and be like, is this like a Will Fuller type consistent thing, or does this sort of just seem like a fluke? Because that's really where my beef lies. It's not so much with the term itself. I just think people are too quick to throw that onto somebody.
Yeah. So is it more of like just something that's reoccurring? Is that what it is? Like if it's the same type of injury, would you consider that more, quote unquote, someone that's injury prone? I hate to use the term, but it's the only way I can describe kind of
No, I understand. So yeah, like a hamstring and groins and hamstrings are actually predictive of each other. If you consistently have, literature shows if you consistently have hamstring, you're more prone to groin and vice versa. And theoretically also then that means quads. So Will Fuller's now struggling with a quad or a groin issue, right? He had like a groin issue. And then if you look at OBJ, for example, he's had like several hamstring soft tissue stuff. And then he had groin surgery this offseason, like the sports hernia. So yeah, it's the recurring injuries are definitely a part of it. But like if you have a player that consistently, has these pulls and they're not like traumatic, like somebody has a traumatic, somebody crushes into their ACL, they tear their ACL, that was just bad luck.
Yeah.
Because it's only like 15% of all ACL tears in the NFL or something.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely the recurring pattern. It's definitely, they've shown they can't stay healthy. And it's sort of just an umbrella. It's sort of just something that you really have to look at case by case instead of just saying, oh yeah, that person's injury prone.
Yeah. So then I guess one more thing I was curious about before we dive into the players here, when you talk about case by case scenarios. So if I'm someone, again, as a sort of casual fantasy football player, and I look at someone like Adam Thielen, who has a hamstring issue pretty much all of last season. When I read, Adam Thielen's expected to play, but he has a Q next to his name, and we know he's coming off of a hamstring problem. Hamstrings are very delicate, right? They're delicate injuries. So if you were to sort of speak some wisdom into 2020 with some of our listeners, how should they treat? Because again, kind of going full circle here on this, I'm trying to get my thoughts together on it. Hamstring problems are very common in the NFL. So it's not just Adam Thielen, but when you get a guy who has a hamstring problem, how should they look at that report when they're thinking about starting a guy with, let's say, hamstring issues?
That's a great question. That's an awesome question because it does matter, right? So there's, I recently was looking at all the hamstring data. Like, imagine what kind of person says that? I was looking at all the data on hamstring injuries. So that's the stuff that I do.
Really not us. That's why we have you on.
It's a beautiful thing that people, outside of like into the research world are trying to wrap their heads around that exact question, right? And really what they found was that the most consistent predictors of future injury is previous injury. And they found a tad bit of change in terms of if it's a grade 1, then that's predictive of re-injury. The reason, if you wrap your head around it, the reason that re-injury within the first 2 weeks is like at its peak point is because if you tell a player it's minor, whatever, they're going to be like, oh, then I can play through it. That's fine. Then you get out and have the exact situation that happened to Thielen. The chances are I'm 99% confident without ever examining Thielen, without seeing the MRI report, anything, he probably wasn't ready to go when he re-injured. And that's the common theme. And literature bears that out. When athletes try to come back too early, they re-injure. So when you are looking, especially if you're a DFS player, those are the types of things to know is like, hey, yeah, this player, he was a limited participant all week and he didn't get downgraded after having a hamstring on, Monday night and he's going to play Sunday. But if I'm in cash games, there's no way that I'm trotting out, Adam Thielen in week 9 or whatever it was when he tried to come back. Like those are the that's the way that you should look at hamstring strains. And so if it's, week 3 or 4 and they seem to be doing fine, maybe a limited practice now and then, they're probably okay, especially if they've shown you that they can perform.
Sure. Awesome. Dude, that's a solid breakdown. I feel much more
You feel a little bit more confident?
I feel so much more safe.
And we're going to call you every Sunday morning.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Just let me know.
Like a warm blanket right now, buddy.
Well, you feel like a warm blanket on a cold night.
Yeah.
Things are getting weird, man.
No, just to even add on to that, I think from a fantasy football perspective, hamstring injuries are by far the most difficult. Like you see someone pull up with a hamstring injury, you're already like, what the fuck? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
This guy for the next 4 weeks. But,
yeah. Cool, man.
Well, so I kind of want to touch on this before we go any further.
Go for it. One more thing.
So we were doing some kind of research for this episode. We were on the website. It's a sports injury predictor. What kind of credibility does it? Here we go. All right. This is what we want to hear. What kind of credibility does this website have? Because they're giving us percentages of guys that could be re-injured, and I'm like, how do they even predict this? Is that even possible? It's all right. You can shit on them if you want.
The short answer is no. If I had all the available data for one player let's say if I had from the second that OBJ started playing football until last week, I had every medical report, every injury, every MRI, every X-ray report. I had all of his subjective reports of it felt like this type of pain. This was a treatment. If I had one player and all their data and information, I had it all gathered, I couldn't give you a percentage, man. I really couldn't. I couldn't say there's an X, definitively there's an X amount of risk that comes associated with this player. What I could do is give you a range, look at the patterns like we were saying, and tell you like, okay, well, in retrospective analyses, based off of one injury, and we'll kind of get into this actually with Dalvin Cook, so it's really helpful. Like when you look at the baseline data, historically you've had this many recurrences for this, and it was in this kind of situation and et cetera, et cetera. So for like each body part, I could give you recurrence rates potentially, but those still aren't perfect numbers. So it would be like a wide range. In other words, the sensitivity, like in research, especially in medical research for, so this would fall under the umbrella of like a special test. Like there's a test called, for example, it's a Hawkins Kennedy test. If baseball players come in, a lot of times they have this stuff where they have just irritation of this part of their shoulder, right? And so my thing is I take their arm and I sort of bend it downwards and they go, ow, okay, that's a positive test. But now I need to look back at the sensitivity. The sensitivity basically tells me, if that's not painful, then and it's a 99% sensitivity, I can 99% say they probably don't have, impingement is what it's called. Yeah. So if you look at their model, because that's what it is, it doesn't have to be just sports, whatever their name is. It's not just, it's this percentage, it's what is their sensitivity. Like you can put a number on it all day. You can say it's percentage or whatever, this or that. What's their sensitivity and what's their specificity? Because I can promise you that their confidence intervals are probably this wide, off the screen wide. And it's not just them, again, anybody. And their sensitivity is probably really, really bad. But for anybody to like give you those numbers, it's not in the interest of business. So,
so basically
that's where I say, and that's just me being honest.
Yeah. So basically, like, I mean, the only people that can give us that information are the doctors who are like rotating Cam Newton's shoulder, basically. Like no one, unless you're getting the medical reports from the doctors themselves, like you're not going to know truly.
And even then, even their own personal docs are like, they could tell you like,
right.
I think that he'll hold up, but it's not ever like a slam dunk.
Right, exactly.
And that's why you'll see all the time, it's a mixed bag when teams take chances on players who are quote unquote injury prone. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. That's because their medical staff is analyzing everything, especially in the age of analytics when we have like retrospective analyses for a lot of things. But we know for a fact that we can't tell you, like sports injury prediction for anybody is impossible. And there are researchers out there who've been trying to solve this question, answer this question for literally like 10 or 15 years. And that's why load management has become a thing in the NBA, especially, is because you see these people trying to solve these complex problems. But the bottom line is that humans are too complex, man. You can have them in the most controlled environment. And there are too many underlying intrinsic factors to be able to say definitively, on this day, or, they're going to injure this part of their body. Like I can appreciate, I'll say this though, I can appreciate trying to solve the problem. I don't want to make it seem like I'm just, oh no, like don't try to answer. Like I get it. I totally get it in trying to answer the question. But, I personally don't feel confident enough, and I don't feel that if I were to compile something like a model to predict injury, I wouldn't feel good about putting it out to people and telling it it works.
Yeah,
I just wouldn't.
Yeah, dude. I mean, I totally understand where you're coming from, and we're obviously talking in the confines of players, the human body. But to your point, I mean, the entire world is trying to figure out predictive analytics. They're trying to understand exactly how well to understand whatever it is that you're talking about, whether it's machinery, AI, sales, marketing. And the reality is that there isn't a perfect formula for any of it, but we do our best to find out what are the types of data that are important to make the best logical decisions possible.
Exactly. So I can understand the sentiment of trying to figure it out. That's totally, I'm on board with that. I get it.
Yep. No, I'm glad you cleared it up, because kind of when the first thing that pops up when you do Google a certain player's injury history is this website. And I'm looking at it, and they're telling me there's a 60% chance that Edwin Engram is going to get hurt again in 2020. And it does seem weird that they would be able to predict that. So I'm kind of glad you cleared it up, because that is probably the number one source that pops up when you do search for a certain player.
If there's ever a number or a percentage associated with something like that, I just take it with a grain of salt,
Yeah, of course.
which
Yeah.
is why in injury analysis, you can break down the flip side. So, right, there's always a statistical portion, right? It's one of the three pillars in physical therapy in medicine, really. You have like the triangle, right? So up here you have research, right? Evidence research and then the left side of the triangle, whatever you guys are, is the patient values. There's a ton of research now showing that if a patient thinks that you cracking their neck when they come to physical therapy is going to make them feel better, and you incorporate that when they're expecting it, then their outcomes are going to be better. If you said, nah, that's not going to work for you.
Wow.
So like, that's nuts, right? And then the other side of the triangle is your clinical expertise, right? So we spend 7, 8, 9, some people spend 10, 11, 12 years in school learning the ins and outs, the intricacies of the physiology, the underlying pathologies that affect it, like all the different things that come into play to the human body, to where you can actually think of, you sort of thought troubleshoot through your head, like, why would that be a thing, and what's a potential solution, what's a position we can put you in, what's a treatment that might work plausibly because of this proposed problem. So not to get too much into the weeds, but those are sort of the things that I think about. Like, it's not always all statistics, and that's not it's funny saying as it's not just that statistics are the most important thing, because the statistics show, it's funny, but like the statistics do show, and the research shows that you need more than statistics. Like, they're not a standalone thing, which is why I think that personalized sort of profile breakdowns for each player is really the way of the future. Unfortunately, that doesn't fall into like the model.
Yeah, makes sense. Awesome.
Sorry, you got me on a rant.
Yeah, no,
That's what we have you on here for.
yeah. I mean, dude, we'll have you on to break this down even further on another episode.
Yeah, absolutely.
But to keep this sort of rolling forward, and sort of the structure of the time frame that we're trying to aim for here, let's dive right into some of the players. We gave you sort of the list here. Again, I'll go in order. So AJ Green will go to Dalvin Cook, Evan Engram, and then Cam Newton. We'll hit. Each of these plays represents one category of a position, exactly. So let's start with AJ Green. The Cincinnati Bengals just put a franchise tag on him. They still believe in him. He's about to be 32 years old. Obviously has a long history with injuries, and I think most recently his foot. So what, from your perspective, are sort of, again, what are we not seeing as sort of the casual fan, not looking at it from a medical standpoint? What is it that you and or the Cincinnati Bengals see in that for AJ Green?
And that's a tough thing to say too. If you consider that, Emmanuel Sanders is 33, Julio Jones is 31, Julian Edelman is 34. And in terms of like fantasy relevant or wide receivers, those dudes are like the OGs. They're the oldest they're the oldest dudes at those positions, still making themselves fantasy relevant every year. And so when you look at, so this is the part where I was like, what I was saying earlier with breaking down specific players. So AJ Green, right? So he's going to be 32 in July. He had a massive reconstruction on his ankle. I remember the first podcast I did with Ben Kukanis over at the Fantasy Free Agents with Joe Dolan and all those dudes. We talked about AJ Green, and at the time he was in a boot. He was on a rolling scooter. He wasn't doing much of anything, and it was like August, and they were saying that he was going to be back for week 8. And I told Ben, he's in a boot and in a scooter. That tells me that the surgeon doesn't feel like he wants him to put any weight down through that foot. So it's a massive procedure, right? Mm-hmm. And then the second thing is, we got to the point where he was doing straight line running in like week 4 or 5. And I'd also said previously, like, until we see him cutting left and right on the practice field and not in an anti-gravity treadmill, you can't really expect much from him. And then inevitably we saw, he didn't come back by week 8. So really, even though he's been rehabbing for the last however long, months, almost a year, he hasn't played in an NFL game. He hasn't played an NFL speed, and he hasn't played with a newly reconstructed ankle. Right. And so to expect a 32-year-old coming off of a lapsed season to just plug right back in, like, I don't care if it's Joe Burrow, I don't care if it's, Jalen Hurts, I don't care who it is, like, this is going to be an adjustment period. And I would especially monitor him throughout training camp and watching his practice reports and sort of like what you reading in between the lines between what's he really doing at practice, because at this point I really can't see him jumping, back onto the X sort of X spot.
Yeah.
I really think that's they're going to have to find a way to work him and Boyd in, because you see these older receivers, they slide into the slot, right? So Edelman's sort of always been a slot guy, but then you saw Larry Fitzgerald slide into the slot. You see these dudes who will convert into a slot receiver as they get older, because they just they're not going to be NFL starting corners anymore, at 33, 34 years old. Right. So they really they rely on their agility, on their skill, on their savviness, on their sort of experience. And they also rely on their dexterity. So their footwork is what people call it, right? And so if he's got a brand new ankle that was, pretty much reconstructed, he's got to move side to side, forward and backwards without pain, right? With the requisite, is what you call it, requisite mobility, like all those different planes of motion. He's going to be using his feet a lot more than just boom, line up on the outside and beat your guy. That's it.
Yeah.
There's a lot that goes into that. And so even if he's rehabbed 100% and is back to the point where he's able to do that, I think it's going to take him a little bit to sort of get back into, or even work into, basically a new position for him.
Yeah.
So approach with caution, I guess, is what I would say.
That's a great, great analysis. Yeah.
Kind of another quick disclaimer too. It's do you feel that as he gets going in the season, gets a few games under his belt, will it eventually help him? Because there might be some sort of there might be a level of concern for AJ Green owners a couple games of the season if he's not hitting the ground running like the typical AJ Green that you normally see. Is his injury something that he'll eventually work through more into the season he goes, or is it going to be like, should we be concerned if he's still not producing?
Right. I think it's a little of both, right? So on one hand, I think the one piece of, and this is sort of a different topic, but the one piece, so if you see like draft Twitter, they're just some of the smartest dudes you'll see. They got these models and like these predictive values, and I'm like, dude, wow, that's a lot. Like even for me, I read this stuff all day, I'm like, God, that's a lot. Good for you. But I think the one piece that's lacking for the NFL draft in general and for like fantasy analysis is the psychological portion. So psychologically, it's so huge, man. Like sports psychologists exist. What's that?
No, it's so true. I agree. That's been my MO on Todd Gurley. So
yeah, dude. No, me too.
I think he lost it up here. I don't think it's because of physical ability. I mean, I know he's got the knee problem. I mean, he wasn't even on our list to talk about, but like to me, watching him drop 2 passes in the NFC Championship game 2 years ago, and the Rams still went to the Super Bowl, but watching him drop those passes, when he makes those 10 out of 10 times, he dropped 2.
One was for a pick.
Went right through his hands. I was like, how do you drop that, dude? Like, I don't know. And then again, I heard Skip Bayless be the first one to actually call that out on national television. And I was like, that's right. He's right. That it's got to be psychological. So anyways, Todd Gurley comes to mind when you talk about that.
Yes. And I feel like that's going to be, and I'm with you 100% on Gurley. I think that plays a huge part of it. And I think for AJ Green, that's going to be another part of it. And I think that it played into why he didn't come back at all during the season. I mean, there were points where there are finally videos of him doing lateral work. And I was like, man, it looks pretty good. And obviously I hadn't seen him do it full speed. I didn't know the whole picture. But, I remember there was one specific week where it was like sort of the peak of when you actually thought you had some hope he might come back. And then it got to like Wednesday or Thursday and he was like, no, F that. I'm not coming back. Yeah. That's got to be up here, right? I mean, it's not at that point, it's not a tissue damage issue. And so I think that for when he comes back, it's going to be one of those things where it's only inevitable. He's going to get to the point where he's like, okay, I can do this,
Mm-hmm.
But will his body hold up for that just based on the everyday NFL struggles, right? Or is his body just, and let's not forget, the dude has had like an entire, like a grade 3 hamstring strain. Like his hamstring literally ripped off of one of the insertion points from his bones. Like the dude has had, outside of this ankle stuff, he's had other injuries. And so it's dicey. It's dicey.
Yeah, I think I said that too when we opened up his research. I pulled it up. I was like, holy shit. It was like 20 injuries.
He's had a lot. Yep. He's had a lot. So I guess my overall like analysis on AJ Green is I'm not going to take him. Honestly, I know this is for especially like one quarterback redraft standard leagues, like 12-team leagues. This might seem excessive, but I'm probably only taking him if he's there like the round after I take a quarterback. Like if he's there in like the 11th, 12th, 13th round, then I'll look at it and be like, okay, maybe a little bit of a lottery ticket, but unfortunately, you can't really rely on him to be, 2013, 2014 AJ Green anymore. It's just not there.
Gotcha. No, I completely. That's why I thought he was such a good player to bring on, especially with all the hype, like you mentioned, with Joe Burrow coming around. AJ Green's probably going to be one of the most overdrafted players, especially with the wide receivers coming in. So it's kind of good that you mentioned that. Might want to hold off on him a little bit. Don't buy into the new QB hype and the whole new revamped Cincinnati offense. Tyler Boyd is probably the much safer pick.
Yeah, 100%.
Having between these two receivers, though.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Good stuff. Cool, man. All right, well then, rolling right into someone who's had some hamstring problems. I believe he's had a shoulder problem and I think an ACL problem. But Dalvin Cook.
Cook.
Yeah, what do you think? So he had a relatively healthy season last year, had a lot of production. If you're someone like me who took Joe Mixon over Dalvin Cook because of those injuries, you got burned.
Ooh, that killed you.
Yep, you got burned by that. So I look at Dalvin Cook and I'm kind of like, well, I look at the injuries, but he had a decent season last year. How do you look at Dalvin Cook?
So I wrote an article on this through the Undroppables, and the first thing that I talked about was the upside. And Dalvin Cook's upside is nuts. I'm not going to argue with anybody that he's not like one of the top, 5 fantasy running backs over the last like 5 years. Even the dude is just good. So what I did is I plotted his the last 10 games or the first 10 games of the season when he was healthy, and then I plotted that against Derrick Henry, Zeke, and Aaron Jones in their first 10 games. And so I wish I could show this on screen, but I'm not smart enough to use Zoom because then you can do screen share.
Yeah,
but
we can probably plug this into our show notes later. That's
okay. So you'll see this orange box for fantasy points sort of going, on the x-axis, and then the y-axis is irrelevant. But you see this orange box for fantasy points, and it's like this much further up. This is Dalvin Cook. This is the combination of Zeke, Derrick Henry, and Aaron Jones. And
like a whole other half bigger for our listeners.
Yes. His median, Dalvin Cook's median is literally 4 points better than those other dudes over that 10-game span. Wow. And his range of outcomes is also much higher. So like his floor, basically, you'd imagine in any of those given 10 games, Dalvin Cook was almost guaranteed to score 15 fantasy points PPR. And those other dudes were down at 10 altogether. Wow. So his ceiling when he's on the field is like nuts, right? His floor and his ceiling. But the problem is the injuries that he's had are, so again, we're talking about patterns. We're talking about individual analysis, individual breakdown, looking at every player and those specific recurrence rates. So he had his first shoulder dislocation was actually in high school. So that one's not documented. We don't know if that was on the left or the right. Then in 2016, when he was at Florida State, it was his right one, and he had surgery for it. Then we had, October 2017. That's when the ACL happened. So you were right on that.
Yep.
And then he had 2 hamstring strains that followed after that, which are almost expected with ACL stuff, but it's still, you got to add it on there. You got to tack it on. Sure. And then you look at he had another, let's see here. Oh, so right. And then he had the SC, so the sternoclavicular joint. So it was like a subluxation or a sprain or something. We don't really know what it was. But it was some sort of like injury, right? That was significant. And then he had the left shoulder dislocation after that. Okay. That's a lot to sort of take in. All of those things, all of those injuries are, it's called connective tissue, right? So ligaments, cartilage, those are the primary like connective tissues of the body. And they're not, so it just basically means they're not muscle. They just go bone to bone. And they're there to sort of keep everything in place. Yeah. So all of these injuries that he's had are to connective tissue. And there are dysfunctions, whatever diseases, whatever you want to call them, that affect people's bodies in terms of making that connective tissue and maintaining it. It just makes them stretchier.
Yeah. And
there's you can go down an entire rabbit hole. Does he have it? Does he not? That would be irresponsible for me to say, oh, he has that, because I haven't seen anything of him. Any of his medical records. I haven't seen him. I don't know anything about the dude's actual medical history, but it would not surprise me if he fell along the spectrum of of disorders where his body just is not as great as maintaining connective tissue, because all of his injuries are legitimately to connective tissue. So there's that idea. And there's also, I have the recurrence rates for his stuff, and I don't remember where I put it, but I have a chart. So essentially, for the shoulder that he's dislocated twice, right? So we had surgery for it once, and then he dislocated it again. So he hasn't had surgery for it that we're aware of. That shoulder on average has about a 40 to 55% chance to re-dislocate again. And maybe it drops a little bit because he rehabs all off season. But if he doesn't have surgery, that's where we're at with just one shoulder.
Yeah.
And then you're also looking at the other shoulder that he did have surgically repaired and doesn't, at least to our knowledge, hasn't came out since then. That's still got about a 13 to 26% chance to re-dislocate.
Wow.
Okay, let's go down to the ACL. So roughly 20% of NFL players who tear their ACL have another ACL tear at some point in their career.
Wow.
So that's a 20% chance for the ACL, right? Theoretically. I know these aren't perfect. Again, these don't like add up. Like they're not perfect math, right? Yeah. But you're sort of looking at it from like a big picture perspective.
Yeah.
And you're like, okay, I hadn't really quantified the risk. I knew there was risk there, but to quantify it and look at it like that from body part to body part, and to have the clinical sort of assessment of his body overall and be like, man, the dude's ligaments and cartilage just can't really seem to hold up. Like, what's going on there? You know, it's something.
Yeah. So even though he's a freak athlete and there's obviously the talent and the mindset, going back to some of the psychology, that's all there. You know, he
resources.
He got the resources. He has a great environment inside Minnesota for production from a fantasy standpoint. But to your point, there's something there from a medical, biological instruction. Again, you can't. It
just doesn't add up.
Yeah, it would be irresponsible to put a prescription on it, but something's a little off there. We're not sure exactly what it is.
100%.
Yep.
That's perfectly worded. Yep.
Which is like
this is great because
the biggest red flag I'll speak from the fantasy side of it. He's going to be a first-round pick in probably every single redraft league out there.
Yep.
You almost have to take him though, right? I mean,
that's
I just told you all those things, right?
Like you're forced to take him. Like if he's healthy, he will be a top 5 running back, like you said. But in the back of your mind, you just had that little shadow of a doubt. And I had him in 2018, and I was almost bald by the end of the season because I was ripping my hair out every week. The guy was questionable. I honestly, Edwin, I might have became a doctor in 2018. I was reading so many freaking medical reports. It was
right.
So it seems like a good draft strategy based on what you're suggesting is, you know, if you're going to go Dalvin Cook in the first round, look to pick up a good, solid, borderline RB1, RB2 in the second round. You have to go back to that. You have to protect yourself in that way.
Yep. And I almost feel like, I don't know, I feel like because everybody else will also be on this train where somebody's going to take Alexander Mattison probably 2 rounds earlier than they should have and take your handcuff from you, or even if he's drafted. Somebody's going to draft Alexander Mattison, right? So, like, you're putting yourself, if you are – because, okay, let's just, like, sort of arbitrage. Let's say that, you know, CMC number 1, Barkley 2. Who are you guys putting at 3?
Maybe Cook, maybe Henry.
Cook, Elliott, maybe.
Elliott, Henry, one of those 3.
Yeah.
Right. So let's say, okay, you're sitting there and somebody took Henry and then somebody took Zeke. You're at the 5 spot and you're like, fuck.
I was really
maybe
like Dalvin Cook.
Maybe you have someone who's a Houston Texans fan inside your group of friends who takes David Johnson.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. So that's the tough part. So I think that if you can insulate yourself with Alexander Mattison, that's actually, especially if you're like in a dynasty league, that's probably one of the smartest things you could do if you are in like a startup or something is, I mean, take him, because obviously fantasy football is all about leverage, all about being a step ahead, all about sort of like almost a stock market, right? So if you can get a step ahead of people and you can and you can draft Dalvin Cook, but then also like stash Alexander Mattison, you're gonna smash. I mean, it's gonna be great, especially if you're looking towards the future.
Yep.
No, I'll 100% be that scumbag to take Mattison.
In like the 5th round, right? Like
I can't wait for somebody to take Dalvin first round, and I'm going to take Madison.
Right.
Enjoy your running back for the first 8 weeks. I'll get him in the second half.
Right. Yeah.
But no, I honestly, he's probably the biggest name in terms of ADP versus his injury history. Mm-hmm. You look at everybody else that's going to go in the first round, and nobody is probably even close to as big of a question mark as Dalvin Cook's going to be.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. Cool. All right, man. Let's move on to the next player. I don't. For some reason, Evan Ingram's near and dear to my heart. I drafted him last year.
I don't know why. He loves this guy.
I love Evan Ingram. So here's sort of my, when I look at Evan Ingram, this is what I see. I see someone who could be, and I'm serious about this, in the top 3 or 2 of tight ends in this league, just from an athletic perspective. I think the environment is getting better in New York. It wasn't amazing last year, but I think Daniel Jones will be good this year, and I like Saquon. I like the weapons around Evan Engram. But again, going back to injury, what's the deal with Evan Engram from a tight end perspective?
So the thing with Evan Engram is he just can't. He's one of those guys that he can't seem to stay on the field, right?
Yeah.
So I'm looking through. I had this this conversation with Pat Thorman, I was like, oh, holy cow, Pat Thorman responded to me. So that was cool. But we were having a little conversation on Twitter about Evan Engram, and I basically said, there's a 2018 study which is pretty recent, and what that study found, and I need to get a hold of the full text because I just had the abstract. I looked everywhere, couldn't find the full text. But essentially, this study on NFL players found that after a Lisfranc surgery or injury or whatever, the offensive players performed worse than defensive players when they came back, compared, relatively speaking, because there was a study like a few years ago saying there was no difference. Well, this new study dug a little deeper and said, okay, but was there? They separated offense versus defense. Lisfranc injuries affect offensive players more than defensive players, and it was clinically or statistically significant. Then they also looked at the amount of missed games over the following two, and like over the second season, so the season after the injury, and then the second season after the injury. And those players missed more time, significant time, compared to the players who didn't have the same position players who didn't have Lisfranc injury. So these players, and like I said, I need to get the full text article, but they're missing more games. Is that because of foot and ankle? Is that by chance? Like, what were the methods there? I need to look into that. But at the very least, to me, clinically, this is where the clinical part comes in. It does make sense to me. If you have this major reconstruction to a foot, you're already a big dude. These injuries tend to hurt big dudes because they just land, sort of down on their foot this way, and there's so much leverage, right? So that lever arm's so long that their bones can't really withstand that, so they'll have whatever damage to the middle of the foot. That's what Lisfranc injuries are. On top of that, he's had multiple MCL injuries, right? And so those MCL injuries, they have about a 10% recurrence rate, depending on where you look. And it's not so much that the MCL injuries are like nagging or anything like that. But it's just, you sort of every time you strain, or sprain a ligament, you're just stretching it out and stretching it out and stretching it out. Eventually it does hit a point where it's just not going to come back to where it was before. And I'm afraid we're getting to that point already with Engram. And then obviously he's had concussions. So the more concussions you have, the worse off you are. Yeah. And that's not a place that I necessarily want to be. Yeah. But the flip side is similar to Dalvin Cook, like we were saying, is the dude's so good when he's on the field. He's an athletic freak. Exactly. And he's like 24 years old or something, like 25 years old. He's not young. So it's like, all, yeah. Yeah. And so it's like when he's like one of those dudes that's if he's active, you're like, fuck, how do I, I'm not going to start Rhett Ellison, right? Me. Or what's his name? The guy for the Bears, Jesper Horsted. I'm not going to start Jesper Horsted over Evan Engram.
Dude, so, you look at your backups and you're like, I can't start any of these guys.
Exactly.
Especially like bad with tight ends too, because
there's nobody else out there.
It's such a barren wasteland of a position as it is. Like,
so when you have Evan Engram ready to go, and it's like, back to, it's almost like the AJ Green question, or the someone with a hamstring, ACL, they look kind of good. You're like, fuck it, I'll risk it.
Right, exactly.
I guess I'll play.
So just a little
else out there.
So a little snippet here. This was from the article I did with Player Profiler. I have the amount. So let's see. So Engram has already missed 14 games. He's missed almost an entire season since he came into the league. Crazy. And which is nuts, right? You wouldn't think. It's like, holy cow. Mm-hmm. And Greg Olsen, who was sort of like a comparable player when he came into the league, because he was really banged up too. I think in that same like 3-year slot, Greg Olsen actually only missed like 2 games or something, and Evan Ingram's already missed like 14 games.
That's crazy.
So it also goes back to like what we were saying with like Will Fuller when we were having that conversation about injury prone versus not injury prone. Like the null hypothesis is Will Fuller can stay healthy. Like the null hypothesis is Evan Engram can stay healthy during a season. And I can't confidently say to people who ask me, like, do you think that he's going to stay healthy? I'm not going to say yes, because I haven't seen it yet. Like from a scientific perspective, if you're viewing it like that on a case-by-case basis, I can't confidently say, oh yeah, Evan Engram should stay healthy, because he just hasn't shown that he can.
Right. Yeah.
You hear that, buddy? He's all yours.
Dude. I love drafting him.
Hey, you got him every year.
He's so
But again, so this is all relative, right? Like this conversation is all relative. Like I'm not saying don't draft Cook. I'm not saying don't draft AJ Green. I'm not saying don't draft Evan Engram. What I'm saying is have your ducks in a row to know what your risk tolerance is, what your league format, all that stuff is, right? Like have in your head an idea where you're like, you know what? If he gets to this point, I'm taking him. I don't care. I'll take it, and I'll take that risk. Like you need to find what your risk tolerance is and weigh it against what the facts are. That's obviously what you do with every player.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's almost like if you in a redraft league, especially if you take Evan Engram, you almost have to at least in the several rounds following, you might want to hedge your bet a little bit and kind of go maybe tight end back to back real quick.
Yeah,
you can't just put all your eggs in Evan Ingram's basket and be like, you know what, I'll pick my second tight end up later in the draft. You want to hedge your bet a little bit.
Well, the other thing too, Edwin, I wonder if, in the leagues that you play, if this is a similar situation, but in our home league, Eric and I's, what'll happen in our league is that like when the first guy picks a tight end or a defense, then there's a run on defenses and a run on and so like
that's how it is for me.
Exactly. So like, you might be like a round later, but Evan Engram and like, last year was OJ Howard was on the board. Guys picked them and you probably should have waited on him maybe 3 rounds later, but they didn't because there was a run on tight ends. And so I guess what you're suggesting is that, again, back to AJ Green or maybe Evan Engram, not so much Dalvin Cook, but Evan Engram, is that be disciplined in not drafting him even though he looks good on paper.
Don't panic. Don't make a panic decision because when you're in there, you can do a million mock drafts, right? But it's never. There are a million different, right? The permutations of how many things can happen. You can do a million mock drafts, and it's never. You're gonna get to that point where like, oh, well, what the? Okay, well, I wasn't expecting this dude to be here, or what the fuck? That guy's already gone. Like, you know what I mean? It's at least for me, that's how it works. It's like
it never works out. You do like 100 mock drafts. You're in the middle of the second round. You're like, what the fuck just happened?
Exactly. You're like, well, I think I just lost my league. Yeah.
When the clock's on you, it starts to feel like the SATs.
Exactly. Right. Exactly.
Someone makes one stupid pick and the whole draft is out the window. Like, what just happened?
Right. It's so annoying. Yeah, I'm with you there.
Good stuff, man. All right, let's move on to our last guy, Cam Newton. So Cam Newton's very interesting because as a quarterback, they're obviously always under siege. As a running quarterback, even more specifically, he's always taken weird-ass hits. How much of his injuries are just from wear and tear as a running quarterback versus, he might have something like Dalvin Cook?
Yes, that's a good question. So I have an article that talks about and breaks down, and I probably need to update it at this point. It talks about running quarterbacks. And I also did a thread on Twitter on running quarterbacks. And there's actually not a lot of data showing that they are objectively hurt more often than non-running quarterbacks. And so that's interesting, right? And it's not to say that wear and tear isn't a thing, but there's also a big difference between having wear and tear, and having 3 concussions versus having wear and tear, but you haven't really had any injuries that anybody knows about, right? It's not the same. It's similar to like a car that, you're driving Southern California through the hills and, you're stopping and starting versus you live in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, and you're driving A to B. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So
sure.
For Cam Newton, he's somewhere in the middle. And his injury, interestingly enough, his shoulder injury didn't happen when he was doing anything. It was random. So he was diving for a tackle. I don't know if people realize that. This is like towards the end of 17.
It wasn't during the Super Bowl, so.
Yeah, right, that's true. So he was diving for a tackle and he hurt his shoulder, and that was like a year-long scenario, right? And he wasn't like the most honest with the medical staff. The medical staff probably botched the way they handled it too, just based off what you read. And then this foot thing, right, in the preseason, he told medical staff he was fine. And then turns out he wasn't fine. Yeah. So it's like all these weird scenarios reading in between the lines, like you guys were saying, that we need to do with injuries is just like, again, if I'm staying honest, it's difficult for me to say like, oh, Cam Newton's going to stay healthy. Like he's going to ball out.
Yeah.
But I on the, the other side is I'm relatively confident that he still has something left in the tank.
Yeah.
And I'm relatively confident that people like complain about his accuracy or whatever the case may be. When he played an entire year, and they cite like the last 2 years, but one of the last entire year, he was literally playing with a torn labrum or rotator cuff, whatever it was. And that wasn't the problem, right? So,
right.
I mean, that was the problem is what I'm saying. It wasn't that he just was all of a sudden inaccurate. And it's never like he's been a super accurate dude, but I think all these sort of factors make Cam Newton a value. And these are like my favorite type of scenarios to like talk about, because it's not like a dude's up here and I'm trying to bring him here. People are already viewing him like in the dumpster, right? So he's gonna be a value. He's gonna be a value to somebody. It obviously depends on his landing spot. Who knows where he ends up? But I think that he's got something left in the tank. And especially, you know, if we're talking like injury risk, the amount of injury risk I'm willing to take on with Cam at this point is like, I'm fine with it. If I get him in like the 13th, 14th round, and I can get like 3 years ago, like vintage Cam Newton for a few games, dude, I'm all over it. Cause I'm not going to, even if he gets hurt, you know, I didn't take him very early and I probably got a backup option. So he's a specific type of player I think is really interesting and fun to think about, because I think he can stay relatively healthy from here on out.
Yeah. Yeah. That's super promising to hear, because I can't wait until he becomes a Patriot.
Yeah.
See, can you imagine?
Edwin, if you didn't know already, we're Pats fans.
Oh yeah, I can understand.
So we're doing our best. We're doing our best to cope right now. But
I was gonna say, you guys are like in a different state of lockdown, right? They were like in a different quarantine. Nobody was gonna leave their house anyway after Brady left.
Oh, dude, you know what's funny? It's so I was just, you know how everyone's doing these like FaceTimes with their friends and shit. Like everyone's doing, you know, and they're posting about them. So I just did a FaceTime with my friends, and I have a couple of friends all over. One of my
I thought you were going to say I did a FaceTime with Tom Brady.
I'd be fucking.
That's what I thought you were going to say.
I'd be all set. Like I would have closed down shop. We'd be good to go. I made it. My life would be all set. No, so I was FaceTime with one of my friends who has a roommate, and she's a Buffalo Bills fan, and she's trying to rub it in basically. And I was like, trust me, I would never trade in the last 20 years of my life to be a Buffalo Bills fan. And they were like, and I mean, that's so rough. It's so rough. I'm like, I'm sorry, I can't.
And in your defense, I would have been like, do you guys have a quarterback?
Yeah. It's like, what are you talking about? How could you rub that in? Like, you know,
what are you talking about? The biggest Josh Allen truther out there.
Oh, I love Josh Allen.
He's fun to watch. Fun to watch, right? He literally just, he's like the dude. You know that dude when you like grew up playing sports with, who just like never really gave a shit, but just always showed up on game day. Like didn't practice, would like skip practice. Like coach was always mad at him, but then he'd show up and like drop 40 points, right?
Yeah.
Or he'd throw
and
like
he's like a nice
touchdowns.
guy.
I feel, right. And he's just like didn't get too high, didn't get too low. I feel like that's Josh Allen. He just kind of like shows up, except now he's in the NFL, right?
Yeah, dude, I totally agree with you. No, I'm a big Josh Allen fan. Look, I'm a big Buffalo Bills fan.
I don't know what it is, dude.
But I can't take a Buffalo Bills fan telling me like, you know, trying to rub in Tom Brady not being with the Pats.
Right.
Like, take a hike. Like
it's like, you won 6 Super Bowls.
Right? Yeah. Like I'm gonna cry over my 6 Super Bowls. You're crazy. Yeah. No, dude. Look, I think this has been awesome. I don't even know how we got on that tangent, but it was.
It was about the Pats.
I tend to do that.
Cam Newton go to the Patriots. That's right. Yeah.
No, it was the only reason we brought Edwin on. We needed we needed confirmation.
A little venting.
All right, let's wrap it up.
Edwin, who is your team?
I gotta say, I am a closet Seattle fan.
Yeah,
I don't bring it up very often because it was. I'm a big Russell Wilson fan, right? I love Russell Wilson. He's great.
Yep.
But since the way that the front office and Carroll handled the whole debacle with the Legion of Boom and how it dissolved that way, it's just it didn't really sit well with me. And now we got fucking Russell Wilson wins in spite of that offense, right? That they basically are just like playing not every single. It's so fucking frustrating to watch. Every single game is like, let's play not to lose. Yeah. And then you get here comes the fourth quarter, and Russ has got to put his cape on, and he's got to go again, and he's taking hits, and he's just throwing these crazy passes. We're going into overtime. It's like, if you would have just ran a play action in the first quarter, we could have probably avoided this entire thing. But let's just hand the ball off to Carson, hand the ball off to Penny. Oh, Russ bootleg. It's like, geez.
Yeah.
It's nice to see that even Seattle fans acknowledge that they don't let Russell Wilson throw the ball enough.
Yeah.
Like
dude, fucking kidding me. We've been saying that the last 5 years.
As Pats fans, throw as much as you want.
Right, yeah, exactly.
The one time they should have ran it, they did. But hey.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So it's like the one time that we let Russ pass was like the worst decision like in the history of NFL play calling, right? It's like, oh,
we see it from a fantasy perspective. You got Russell Wilson. The dude, listen, the guy is just as much talent as Mahomes. I don't care. He's got probably the best people.
100%.
He's got the best people in the league, and they don't let him throw it. It's wild. You got a dude that looks like Megatron out on the outside. You got Tyler Lockett. Let him air the ball out 40 times a game. It blows my mind. Whole different tangent, but
yeah, I'm with you, man. Preach.
Dude, all right, man. Let's wrap this thing up. Again, you came out and joined us here. Where can people find you? Where can they get more information like this? I know that you do some work on the side with some other podcasts or websites. So maybe kind of just give us a rundown as again, where people can find you and get more insight.
Yeah. So if you just follow me on Twitter, that's where I put all the stuff out at FFStudentDoc. I'll be changing it soon. Who knows when my test will be at this point? Hopefully, May 4th or 5th is when I was scheduled to get my results back from my test, and I officially can call myself doctor. Awesome. But we'll see what happens with everything going on. But yeah, just follow me on Twitter at FFStudentDoc, and that's sort of the central hub for everything. And I said my pinned tweet is that I've been sort of backing off a little bit just because I am diving into board studying, so I'm not putting out as much stuff. But I do have a relatively big piece coming out soon through 4for4 that I'm really excited about. It's not quite done yet. That's what I'm working on. But yeah, Twitter, FFStudentDoc.
Can you give us a glimpse as to what that article is about on 4for4?
Yeah, I'll tell you. It's about injuries.
Damn, I thought we were going to have the inside scoop.
I'll give you a little teaser. Right. Okay, a little teaser. Yeah. Have you ever looked at your team and just seen a row of Qs and thought to yourself, man, if only I knew what the real risk was of starting all these Qs.
Yes.
That's your teaser, okay? So if you've ever sat in that position,
hey, we'll take it. We'll take it.
We will heavily push this thing, my man. Absolutely. Yeah. Dude, again,
I appreciate you guys having me on, by the way. You guys are great.
Great. Yeah. I mean, it was awesome when Eric told me about, the connection you guys had. And again, my skepticism with injury prone players, I was like, we got to have him on. I need to know more. And dude, I think this is a good conversation. Our listeners, I think, should appreciate, all the insight that you brought to the table today. So thank you very much.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. I appreciate you having me on.
All right. Take care, bud.